thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time with us. And I know you've got a whole presentation and you'll be building a CRUD application for us. But before we jump in, not sure how many of you guys had a chance to take a look at Ryan's LinkedIn. He's had a pretty interesting career. So Ryan, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about your journey. You've worked at companies like Nike, you've worked at Motu, and now you're running your own shop at Serverless. And from what I've heard, you've recently moved to Puerto Rico. Your team expanded from 4 to 20 in the last year. So congratulations, first of all, for an incredible success at Serverless. But yeah, over to you. I'd love to learn a little bit more about you before we get started.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for that type of intro. That's amazing. So I started doing software development back in 2017. I went to a code school. And during the code school, there was a student that was alongside me that had a brother that was a cloud developer. So I got a chance to ask him questions and learn a little bit more about what that actually means. And what I found out was that, you could get a certification, you could take classes from a cloud guru and other platforms. And by getting that knowledge, you then have a chance to not only get into a front end or back end role, but actually become a cloud developer, which was a new emerging market at the time and still is very much today. And so we started studying cloud certifications. And then Ryan Kroonenberg, one of the founders of the Cloud Guru, basically said in the opening video that serverless was the future. And me being completely fresh to the software development industry and also having little side businesses that I did in the past, I heard that and I was very much looking to, I want to do what is current, like the most cutting edge thing right now, because I'm starting from scratch, so why not? And so I built a Alexa skill with a team of people at the code school, and it allowed for train arrivals in Portland, Oregon. And so you would ask it like green line, or what is the stop? And then what is the train? And then what is the arrival? And you get all that information back, and it was all powered by serverless and some of the stuff we'll talk about today as well, such as like Lambda functions and Node.js and a whole bunch of other AWS services. From there, I then was like, okay, I've got this understanding of serverless, but I don't really know how to get a job doing this. And so I was like, all right, well, what if I just create my own platform thing and I start working on that? And then in that process, I'll gain skills and then I'll be able to market those skills and get a job. That was the idea behind it. So I was trying to automate some part of AWS and I was failing really bad at it, but I had about 3 weeks of working on it, 3-4 weeks. And in that time, doing that full time, I learned so much around building serverless applications and how to just communicate about it that I then got reached out to by a recruiter for a position at Nike. And weirdly, 80% of the job description was what I was doing during that 4-week startup thing. So I did the interview and then I ended up getting the job, and that was super exciting. Because it felt like for me, coming from Texas and working fast food and then doing data entry and then getting into a code school and then going through that whole process, being like completely all in on it, to finally get that job, it felt like a huge relief. And then I started learning a little bit I was actually in the innovation engineering department there, which was really, really crazy to think about. I'm still now thinking back on it because I was surrounded by a lot of people that had done really amazing things. And we were working on projects that hadn't been released from Nike yet. And so it's this like startup inside of this gigantic mothership of Nike. About 8 months of doing serverless application development there, a company called Motu reached out to me and they were doing serverless consulting. And that's really where I started going, okay, I want to double down, triple down on doing serverless development. Serverless consulting feels like the right leap. And so I left, I went to work for them for about 6-7 months. And then at some point I started feeling like I was confident in what I was doing. I could see a little bit more of the full picture of what it would look like to run my own consulting company. And so in late 2018, I started Serverless Guru. And at first it was, I'm going to take some side projects. I'm going to make a blog. I'm going to make a training course. And all those things ended up happening. However, once I started saying, I've got this business and I'm doing this service, I had all the contacts and networking from the code school and all that stuff started reaching out to me and saying, hey, Ryan, could you help us with this project? And so gradually, little by little, I got so overwhelmed. I had 3 projects and I was trying to juggle all this. And then I had contacts from the code school. So I brought someone in to help with me there. And then slowly through 2019, it scaled up into early 2020. The pandemic hit. We got a blow to us around there. But then around October of 2020, we started picking back up again and we scaled really fast from there. So We're now up over about 20 people plus, and we're in 10 different countries. We recently just hired 2 people from Africa, which was our first hires in that entire continent, which is really exciting for us. But we have Eastern Europe, Western Europe, India, New Zealand, Canada, US, lots of people from Brazil, Portugal, Argentina, and then now I'm here in Puerto Rico, as mentioned.
That's awesome. I love your journey. I think the fact that you have a coding school background, and that to me, that's pretty incredible. And a lot of people that come into the Mint ecosystem have also gone through the coding school, and they get a lot of rejection because there's still that stigma that's attached to it. Mintbean is very much at the edge of removing that stigma because we see a lot of potential at what the bootcamp world is doing and how quickly developers learn within that 12-week period as opposed to a 250-week period in universities. When you picked up serverless, what was that thing that drove you to it? Like, how did you know this was going to be that big thing? Like, how did you know? Like, I only found out about serverless, of course, through Monarch, but I didn't know that it was trending as hot as it is.
Yeah, I think a lot of good timing and just, some fortunate situations that happened. I was really trying to seek out how to differentiate myself, because in the floor that we had at the code school in Portland, there's about 150 students there. And I learned really quickly that everyone following the same course material, 150 people coming out, 30 people graduating like every month or every 2 months or something. And then having 6 code schools in Portland, and then hundreds of code schools or thousands of code schools around the US, all learning similar material. I was looking for something extra that I could add on. And then when I found that learning cloud and learning serverless, it was a complement to the web development and the mobile development that I was doing at the code school. And it just enhanced that a little bit more. And learning that and just being fortunate enough to have exposure to it. Once I did find out about it, I was just like, okay, I'm doing exactly what I was doing before, but now I have this cloud aspect. And what I realized from being there is that we learned how to build applications, but not so much move them into production or host them or deploy them or all the other processes around it. And what cloud really did was it exposed me to all this information that I wouldn't have gotten for probably years, actually, I would probably say. So, because coming out of the code school, based on the stigma, as you talked about, you usually get put into a box of a junior developer or an intern, and then you have to work your way up and you get a limited amount of information about how the whole thing works. With cloud, it was just like this avalanche or this waterfall of information. And at first it was super overwhelming, and then eventually get a little bit more comfortable with it. The Alexa app thing, now I could do that really fast. Back then it probably took me like 3 weeks. So I think like over time you learn a little bit more, but yeah, that's how that happens. So just very fortunate timing as well on that.
Yeah, no, very cool. I love your journey. I had a chance to, like I said, to talk to your team, and yeah, you guys are doing some awesome work. Serverless grew, like you said, grew from 4 to 20 in the last year. That's quite an incredible accomplishment. So congratulations again. Yeah, I'm excited for today's talk. Let's get started. Guys, I am going to go away and let Ryan take over. All right, Ryan, ready when you are.
Let me open my screen share here. Okay. Can y'all see that? Okay. Assuming so.
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. All right. So I did a little bit more prep this morning, added a whole bunch of stuff. I know we're already like 17 minutes into the, the talk today, so I'm going to try to go rapid fire, but I have a slideshow, and then I've got a demo, and then we'll work through doing some stuff, and potentially there's way more than we'll fit in an hour, but we'll see how that plays out. So the name of this talk is Serverless CRUD API. I wanted to give a little bit about Serverless Guru. It's already mentioned, so I can go a little bit faster here. But the big thing is that as people are watching, if y'all are coming from a code school, you're learning about serverless 6 months from now, a year from now, maybe you go to 2 different jobs, maybe 3 years from now. If y'all are ever really getting involved in the space and then you end up looking for a job, definitely hit Serverless Guru up on that front, because we're growing and we're trying to continuously put stuff out. Like my week this week is absolutely crazy. It's the first week I've done 2 podcast episodes and like conference talks and then this Mintbean presentation. So it's a lot. So this is really great. And we're getting more exposure to clients. And then of course we have the need for more developers on our team. Little bit more about my background here. Founder of Serverless Guru. also wear two titles at the moment, CEO/CTO. I still get imposter syndrome just because I'm wearing two titles. It's not, since I've been doing more of the CEO role, I've noticed the CTO role has fallen a little bit, and then I have to bring it back up to balance it out a bit. But I can confidently say that there are people at Serverless Guru that have much more serverless experience than I do now, which is really amazing, actually. And so I'm also a co-host of a podcast called the Talking Serverless podcast, where we sit down with serverless practitioners and some of the like leaders in the space. So like Yan Kui, who is the Burning Monk, as well as Jeremy Daly, CEOs of different serverless companies that are out there, CTOs of different companies that are out there, as well as individual contributors that are building cool stuff in the space. And then we get to talk to them. And from there, just go down rabbit holes about stuff. And the most recent one, that episode we did yesterday or the day before, was with Nader Dabit, and it had a blockchain element to it. And so that's very exciting. So how does serverless interact with blockchain, and what does all that stuff mean? And that'll probably come out in 3 weeks. And then Serverless Economics podcast, more stuff coming on that soon. And then the Serverless Zero to Paid Professional course. This is a real big one, and this is what the talks are based around. It's not purely to sell like training courses, but the training course that I made it's called Serverless Zero to Paid Professional. It has 94 videos on it. And to prepare for this talk, I reused some of the code and then updated it to have a front end and stuff like that as well. That'll come back up through the talk. So what will we build today? We're going to do some serverless framework stuff. So infrastructure as code. We're going to do a Node.js CRUD AWS Lambda function. So at the moment, this is just a single function that has the full CRUD functionality inside of it. It was about 180 lines of code total. You could take it and split it up into 5 separate functions, which is sometimes considered a best practice when building serverless applications. And that's shown in the course as well, since this is like the code pre-splitting it up, just for context there. And then also, this is the new thing for this talk, is I made a vanilla JavaScript CRUD front-end code. I like this screenshot because of line 3 through 10, it looks like very clean, and it's all one line, but it's handling the like calling out to the helper functions. And so we'll talk about that too. And then also local/real testing with Insomnia. So when you're building APIs, you have to test those APIs. You can both run a local server on your laptop to test APIs, and you can also test the real deployed serverless API using Insomnia as well. The equivalent would be Postman, if y'all are familiar with that. And then here is this beautiful CRUD front-end code, and with vanilla JavaScript, you can see here, very good font types. And yeah, you've got delete, update, you get all users, and then create a user. And you even have get user by ID, except it's not like very clear. We'll see it when we're in the code, but we don't actually have like specific pages for individual users. So that's what we're building today. Some high level overview stuff I wanted to do before we jump in is talk about some terminology, services that are on AWS, and then some files that we'll be looking at, and then commands, and then we'll just jump in. So what we have here is AWS. So AWS stands for Amazon Web Services. It's a cloud provider with the most mature serverless offerings. That's my opinion. And serverless would be fully managed services on AWS. This is also my opinion on how to describe it. If y'all aren't familiar with the space, the word serverless is always a point of contention, and can be described in different ways. I think about it as fully managed services. And so we're basically taking the overhead and the responsibility, and we're passing it to somebody else so we can focus on what makes our stuff different. So instead of creating a server and then trying to do a load balancer and then trying to scale that out, we say, no, thank you. I just want to write my business logic, and then we'll use AWS Lambda, and AWS will handle all that stuff for us in the background. And so that puts 100% of my energy towards the code and towards building features for customers. And before, when I was spending 60 to 70% of the time trying to get the infrastructure set up, now it's a little bit more streamlined. Infrastructure as code, that would be that first file we looked at, the serverless framework. And so this is used to build cloud applications. So it's basically, you can think about it like a recipe. And so you write down in the recipe, I want a Lambda function that's Node.js that will time out after 30 seconds. I want an API gateway instance with these REST API endpoints. So /users/feeds/account. And then I give that to AWS using my infrastructure as code file. And then they create the resources. They spin it up in their data centers. They do all this automation in the background. But for us, it's just a simple YAML format that we hand to them, and then they do all the stuff in the background. I also listed Homebrew here. So I'm on Mac. So all the instructions listed today are going to be from a Mac perspective. You can find alternatives with Windows if you're on Windows or Linux. I just don't have those on hand. And then Node.js is going to be our JavaScript for the backend. And then to go back to infrastructure as code, serverless framework makes infrastructure as code easier for cloud apps on AWS. The word infrastructure as code, there is a service from AWS called CloudFormation, and that is AWS's way to do infrastructure as code. But it's made to support all the possible use cases, and so it's complex to work with directly. And then somebody came along and they're like, hey, let's make it easier. And so they made an abstraction over the top of CloudFormation called Serverless Framework. So you can still use CloudFormation documentation and still reuse CloudFormation templates. But if you're going to do some things, it's a little bit easier with Serverless Framework. And that's where I started working with in 2017, and at Nike, and then at Mo2, and then since all the way through to now and current with Serverless Guru is with Serverless Framework. And then YAML, if this is your first time hearing it, it's just like JSON. So JSON being like an object structure, keys and values and arrays and all that stuff. You can do the same thing with YAML. It's just some people would say it's a more human readable way of doing it. And I think that I would follow that opinion as well. All right, services. So a couple of services that we'll talk about today. The first one is AWS Lambda. So this is a core serverless offering. So I've been asked this before, hey, Ryan, what should I learn first? And I would say Lambda first. A lot of times it's considered the glue code. It's like cloud glue. So it stitches all these different cloud services together. It's also where you host your business logic. So the Node.js code goes directly on it. So it's basically, if you're familiar with a virtual machine or a container, this is the equivalent of that for serverless, which is a Lambda function. On GCP, on Google Cloud Platform, or on Azure, it's probably just called Cloud Functions. AWS Lambda has a different term for it, but it's the same thing. Then you have AWS API Gateway. So this is another core serverless offering for building REST APIs, and also would fall underneath that fully managed aspect of it. AWS IAM, this is cloud permissions. So for API Gateway to talk to Lambda, and for Lambda to talk to S3, which might store images and videos and documents, you have to give permissions for all these different services to talk to each other, and that comes through AWS IAM. For AWS DynamoDB, this is the core serverless offering for NoSQL databases, and the AWS team built DynamoDB with Lambda in mind and how it scales in mind. And so a lot of the stuff that you'll find, including the course that we've developed at Serverless Guru, as well as other resources in the community, are probably going to lean towards using DynamoDB, which is a NoSQL database. And if you're familiar with other stuff like MongoDB, which is another NoSQL database, or even Firebase, the way that you work with DynamoDB is slightly different, just based on vocabulary and things like that. But really, there's a lot of resources now to learn from that you can get going with. Files wise, I've got the serverless.yaml file. This is the core for all serverless framework projects written in YAML, as we talked about earlier. And this is our infrastructure as code. Then we have the api.js file that we'll look at, which is our backend Node.js code powering the CRUD API. So request comes in, the JavaScript processes it, and then sends a response back. Then we have our package.json and our node modules, and that's for handling the different project dependencies. Commands that we're going to be looking at, we have the serverless deploy command. So as the name says, this is going to deploy our infrastructure as code and also the Lambda code to AWS. And then we have serverless remove, which is the opposite, which is now destroy everything that I just did. And then we have serverless offline. And as we talked about with Insomnia earlier in API testing, when we want to test locally, we use something called serverless offline. It doesn't support everything, but it does support our use case here, where we're building REST APIs and Lambda functions. All right, so getting into the live demo, we have an article here, which I'm going to open up. A while back, one of the first articles that I made was basically called Guide for Serverless Project. And it was because the setup to actually create this stuff, it does take some time. And that's like one like asterisk to, is this a full code along? Potentially not, just because you have to create an AWS account and there's a lot more setup there, like getting your AWS credentials. And I won't go through creating AWS credentials, just in case anybody out there is looking to do some free Bitcoin mining on my account. And then we have deployment of very basic Lambda and testing, and then a review of the backend code from the Zero to Paid Professional course, local testing, and then deployment to AWS. And then finally, a review of all these different services being used. So let's go ahead and take a look. So this is the article here. And I'm sure the slides and all this stuff will be sent. Maybe I can pop this in chat. Let's see. I can. Okay, so I just tossed the article in the chat. So you can see here that this was made back in 2018, summer of 2018. And what it basically goes through, I won't read it out, is it basically goes through the full setup of your first serverless project. And that's what we're talking about here. So at a high level, if you're on Mac, you're going to install Node, check the version. You can see a screenshot here of doing that. And then we have the npm install globally serverless. So this npm package is for the serverless framework. They came in really early and they were able to grab serverless.com and also literally the word serverless on everything. So there's often confusion of what is serverless? Is it the framework, or is it this fully managed service? Is it this like concept, or is it actually the company? In this case, it is the company. Serverless is serverless framework. And other things that we talk about today, it will be the concept serverless. So once we get it installed, you can see down here, finishes running. And then now we get to the creating an AWS account. So I'm just gonna scroll through these steps. Once we create the account, we talk about IAM, as you all remembered earlier. This is cloud permissions. And so what we have to do is we have to create what's called a IAM user. And that user is going to have admin permissions to our account. We're giving it admin permissions because this is a tutorial. This would be your private account. You have to be very careful with sharing any of that stuff. I would say don't share it. Also try to limit your cloud permissions to not make them admin level, because bad stuff can happen. But for the sake of time and development, we're creating an IAM here that has admin permissions. So this is what the screen looks like. We hit add user. And you can also see here, we're giving it a name of serverless-admin and then giving it programmatic access. There's two different types of access with AWS. There's programmatic and there's console level access. So if you're a human, you might need console level access. That's what this screen looks like. So you can see I'm inside of my AWS account. We can see the AWS Lambda up here. This is for humans. And then we have the programmatic access. That's for the CLI, for the API, those type of things. That's for our scripts and all that. Then here, as mentioned earlier, we give it administrator access. That gives the serverless framework the ability to deploy all different types of resources. We create the user, and then we get this access key and secret access key. These are going to be these are going to be saved from the browser and then put into your terminal so that you can connect your local laptop to your AWS account so that you can then make serverless framework deployments. So you can see here, we open the terminal, we run this command here. There's one for serverless framework specifically that's called serverless config credentials. There's another one that AWS has itself called AWS configure. Really what they're both doing is they're creating a file locally on your laptop that AWS knows to look for that has your access key and secret key. And those two things allow you to connect your laptop to AWS. And so you feed it here, the access key and the secret key. We hit enter. And now we can actually move to doing real stuff. The serverless framework has these templates that have been created by the community just as starter projects. And so now we can actually switch to the terminal and actually start running these ourselves. And I'll just scroll through this a little bit. So in this case, we're using a template that's already been created called AWS-Node.js. And then we're giving it a path, and the path will also create the folder at the same time. Gives you a cool little terminal output. CD into it. We can open it up in our text editor. We can see the serverless.yaml that it creates for us automatically. And then we can deploy it. and you can see the output here. So let's now switch over to, we'll stop here and see if there's any questions or anything so far. Okay, I've got an eye on the chat, so just let me know if anything comes up. So what we're doing right now is we're switching into a Visual Studio Code view of the SRA course, which is a really terrible acronym. I learned later. After you name things, it's very hard to change names in the future. But the SRA course is what we're working on currently, and it is on GitHub here. So let me grab the link to that. So underneath the Serverless Guru organization on GitHub, we have the SRA course, and then we have this branches here. So let me make sure to zoom in. This is important. The master branch is not the current one that we're looking at the moment. It's the Mintbean. And so I made a separate branch to not mess up the flow of the course, because we were separating them by branches and stuff with the course. And so that's how that plays out. So let me send this link as well in chat. That way y'all can clone it down, follow along on that end. And before we jump into looking at all these files here, we are going to create a project locally. So let's go ahead and do that. So we can run the SLS create. SLS is the shorthand way of saying serverless and SLS, in this case, are for the serverless framework CLI, which allows us to create serverless framework projects. So we say serverless create -template, AWS Node.js, and then we can give it a path and we'll just say temporary. So you can see we get this cool output here. This is serverless, and it created this boilerplate project. And also if we refresh, we have the desktop code. Okay, there we go. Let me redo that command. Call it temp1. Okay, so now we get this folder that shows up here. And this is nice because what it just did is it created code for us. So that's awesome. And then it gives us this serverless.yaml file and a handler.js file. If we just look at the handler.js file, what it does is about 15 lines, but it's all that you need to actually get a Lambda function working. And so the request comes in and then it responds back. And when it responds back, it'll say, go serverless v1. And so let's start working on getting that running. Then we have the serverless.yaml file. And something that I like to do each time is I delete all the comments just to make it easier to read. So now we have this, and now it's only 9 lines of code, which is much easier to work with. So what we can see here is there's a provider section, and this is our infrastructure as code configuration. And because serverless framework supports other cloud providers, we have to tell this serverless.yaml, what cloud am I going to? And we tell it AWS. And then what runtime, what programming language is the Lambda function going to use? And we say Node.js 12, which is the current, at least it's the current supported by this template that gets generated. Lambda hashing version. Honestly, this is something that they added in recently, and my understanding of why this is here is still murky. I thought they should probably add this in the background, but it's now required. So if we don't have it, it'll actually tell us to add it. And then we have the functions definition down here. So on line 7, this is where we actually get into defining our Lambda functions. And so I believe we can do something like this. So let's say we want to create 3 Lambda functions. We can say hello1, hello2, and hello3. And we point it to the same code. So handler.hello. Handler is the handler.js file. And then hello is this function here. So we can change this, and we can say handler, and we can change this file and call it index. So we just changed the function name and also the file name. And then we can come back in here. So the first one is the file name, so index. And then we would change hello to handler. There we go. Okay, so with that, now we can, let's do a couple more things. So I'm going to say npm init. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And I'm just going to click through all these different prompts. So what we're doing right now is setting up this project, this temporary folder for our Node.js project. And then we're going to install, say install save dev, serverless offline. So as we talked about earlier, we can run a local server and we can test things. And so that's what we're doing here as well. Perfect. And then now we're able to do, I just remembered we don't have the proper, I'm going to cheat and look at my other template here. So we're just going to copy this here and I'll talk over it. Okay, so we just added in the handler part that was pointing to the file that actually has our Lambda code. The events section is actually what connects to our Lambda function. So if we have a Lambda function in the ether, then it's not really that useful. But when we connect it to stuff, that's when it gets really useful. So we talked about API Gateway is that fully managed REST API service from AWS. So now we just have to connect that service to our Lambda function so that we can use a URL to the API Gateway that'll then connect to the Lambda function, process the request, and then send it back to API Gateway and then back to our front end. And so this is why serverless framework is a lot simpler, is the CloudFormation is because we're able to accomplish a lot just with 5 lines of code. And so what we're going to do here is we'll just leave all this stuff the same. The path is /users, and it's going to be a get method. And then I'm just going to go ahead and deploy this. So I'm going to add 2 extra things here just for being a bit better about this. So stage and region, and there's different regions on AWS. The stages, this could be prod, it could be test, it could be QA, but we're going to call it dev. And all that's going to do is going to change the names of our Lambda functions to have the word dev on it. So we can look at that in just a second. And now we can do a -v, and that's for verbose. And so this will give you extra log output. And so let's see what we didn't do. Oh, okay, we not CD'd into the right directory. So let's do that first. And then now let's deploy. So what you can see here happening in the terminal is it's starting to create a whole bunch of resources in the background. And this is why serverless framework is so powerful, because we never defined an S3 bucket. We never talked about CloudFormation yet. There's a lot of things that's creating in the background for us automatically that we didn't have to think about. And that's really where a lot of this power comes from. And so on that note, let's go to the AWS console. And we can probably just try to refresh this here. Sure I'm in the right region. We could also look at CloudFormation. As I mentioned, CloudFormation is the layer underneath serverless framework. So serverless framework is the abstraction. CloudFormation it can be talked to directly, but it's a little bit more complex. And so when we use the serverless framework, it is still using CloudFormation, but it's translating our simplified stuff to what CloudFormation understands. And let's see if we have a stack here now. There we go. So we can see temp1 dev. And so already we're getting a cloud application deployed onto AWS, which was pretty quick. You can see that the status is update complete, which means all the resources were deployed. And I'm going to open a second tab here, and we're going to go to Lambda. And then in the Lambda console, you can see that we have 3 Lambda functions now. So we have temp1 dev hello1, hello2, and hello3, which is what we did over here. So we defined hello1, hello2, hello3. Now just imagine you could now create 3 separate files and have different business logic, maybe for CRUD, right? And then connect those to the individual Lambda functions, and so they would be processed properly. Excuse me. Then on the hello1 here, we have the HTTP path and event. So right now, these 2 Lambda functions, hello2 and hello3, these are just Lambda functions. But for Hello One, this one is now connected to API Gateway as well. And it has a path of /users, and it has a method of get. And so let's look specifically at Hello One and see what the difference is. So you can see here that on the left side, you can see the word API Gateway, and you can almost see this line very faintly that connects to the Lambda function. Now, if we go back and we look at Hello 2, we don't see anything on the left side, which means that the Lambda function is just a Lambda function by itself. And to do powerful things, we want to connect it to other stuff. So we want to API Gateway to Lambda, or S3 to Lambda, or DynamoDB to Lambda to have more powerful applications. And we can also go to API Gateway. So let's do another tab here. So inside of API Gateway, we should see our API shown. So we see dev temp1. And then we can see that we have one endpoint here of /users with a get. So let's make this more exciting, and let's add a post method as well. So we'll flip back to the serverless framework here. We're going to copy line 12 through 16. We're going to add it underneath Hello 2. And this time we're going to say this is a post method. And we'll add another one under here. This says delete. And while we're at it, let's add a couple more just to flesh out the CRUD demonstration. So delete, puts, and another get. And then we can go through and change this. So say get user, create user, delete user, update user, and get all, or we'll just say get users with an S. Okay. So now we have our setup for our CRUD functionality. And so how do we redeploy this? We just run SLS deploy again. And so now the serverless framework that the serverless framework code that we just updated is now going to be picked up by the serverless framework CLI and then sent to AWS. And then once this finishes running, we can then flip back to AWS and we can see all of our stuff deployed. Something I'm not going to do with this one is I'm not going to show rewriting all the backend business logic, but I do have a file that we can talk over. That way we save time on that end. So the whole reason why we see all this output here happening, all this different create in progress, create complete, delete skipped, it's because we gave it that -v, which is for verbose. So if you didn't want to see this, then you don't have to do it. I like it. It makes me feel like it makes me feel like that meme when you're like, I'm a developer and you just got all this matrix code happening. So it feels like I'm doing a lot, especially if I'm in a coffee shop or something and then someone's looking at my laptop and it'll be like, oh man, they're hacking into the NSA or something. And then you can see here as well that it gives us this output that gives us all the endpoints for accessing our API. So we can actually use these now. But first, let's go ahead and switch back to the API Gateway console. As you saw here before, we just only had one endpoint or one method, which was the get, but now we should have 5. So if we refresh, you can see that we now have delete, get, post, and put. I won't talk over the options one. It's something for what's called CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. And it's basically required if you're going to have your front end talk to your back end in this whole setup. It's always a tricky subject when it gets deep into the weeds. So I'll skim over that one. But what we're going to do is we're going to test this API. So inside the API Gateway console, how do we replicate testing? And so you can see here this test button. So we'll click that. And then we can go to the test button here and click it. And we get back a status code of 200, success. We see the latency here. And we also see that message, go serverless, your function executed successfully. And then we have this input object that comes back. So where is this coming from? Let's go and modify it and then redeploy. But this time I'll show a different command where we can deploy just one function, because now our serverless framework is starting to get a little bit more complex, right? We have 5 different Lambda functions all being deployed. If we make a change, maybe we just want to deploy it to one. So let's talk about that. So in here, in this Lambda code, we have the go serverless v1, your function executed successfully. So now let's change this to say Mintbean. And instead of doing SLS deploy, which is deploy everything, we can now do SLS deploy function dash, I believe it's dash F. And then let's just update one function, which would be get user. And we'll do dash V again. Okay, so it said that it packaged the function, it uploaded the function, and it successfully deployed the function. So that was much faster than deploying everything, which is why I just made that update. However, I only made the update for this one Lambda function. All the code currently uses that same file. So create user and get user should have different results. So we can test that too, because we only deployed it to one function, not to all of them. I'm going to refresh just for peace of mind, and then go back to the test button here. And let's run test. I think we're not seeing what I was hoping for. Unfortunate. Let's see there. So I think I might have mixed up something there, which is, let's try it one more time. But instead of get user, let's do create user. And then I'll refresh. So now we clicked on the post method, which is the create user function. And now we're going to hit test. And we can see that Mintbean shown successfully, which is fantastic, which means that we're now able to modify our code locally and then deploy it to AWS. And you can see that it happened very fast. And so we could keep changing this, and we would keep seeing those updates happen. And so this is a nice workflow, but we can also test this locally. So I brought up that serverless offline thing previously. So let's go ahead and run that command. And we get an error here. And so why are we getting an error? This serverless offline functionality, it wasn't actually created by the serverless framework. It was created by the open source community. And that's one of the big things with the serverless framework, is that it's for open source. And so what that means is that anybody that hits some type of use case, they can create a what's called a plugin for the serverless framework. And then we can install that into our serverless framework project and use that functionality. And so it's a way for the serverless framework team to stay small and focused on what they're doing, while allowing the entire world basically to add features for the framework. And so this serverless offline one, we're getting back from the serverless framework here is that we haven't installed it properly. So one step that we did do is that we installed it with npm install, and you can see it inside of our package.json. But we also have one more step, which is to add it into the actual configuration file. And so just there's a functions section here where we define our Lambda functions. There's also this custom property where we can define custom variables. Excuse me, I think I'm doing that wrong. 1 second. So there's the custom variables, which is for defining custom variables for different things. We'll talk about that later. And then there's a plugin section, and we have to just define serverless offline here. So I'm going to copy that and paste it in. And so now we're telling serverless framework, use this plugin. So let's rerun it. Hopefully the result is different. Okay, so it's showing that we have existing routes that are conflicting, which is probably what ended up happening earlier. So let's just delete get users for the time being and rerun this. Okay, so it went through. You can see here that we have HTTP localhost 3000 dev/users. So let's now open up Insomnia. So this is Insomnia here. I'll make it a bit bigger. So you can see we have localhost 3000 dev/users. And now we can start making requests to it. So I'm actually going to go through the process of creating a collection here just to show what that looks like. So we can go to create request collection. We'll call it temp1. And then I'm going to hit this plus button here, hit new request. And now we're going to just say get request. And then I'm going to paste the link in, which we can copy from here. And now we can run it. So we can hit send. And you can see back that we get Mintbean. So that's working. We now know that. We can also do the post method. So let's try that. So we get that back as well. We can do the put method. That works. And delete. And that works too. And so now we're testing the full CRUD functionality of our API. And already we could do something with the front end where we could actually give it that GET request and we could see stuff come back. And so if we switch this to a GET method, and we just copy the link, and I can actually show you what this looks like in a Chrome browser. So when we run it, we actually get this back. And now our front end code, whether it's React or Angular or just vanilla JavaScript, could now use this API endpoint to then get back data from our backend API. And so imagine that we didn't want to say Mintbean. Imagine that we wanted to do a database lookup and then say, here's the data, here's the profile information for the user, right? Maybe it's their profile photo, maybe it's their job title, maybe it's their first name and last name. And we can now get that back, and then we can loop over it and we can show it inside of our HTML code. All right, so on that topic, I think we're set. So that is how you run a local server locally. And we can step through this code here. Now what I'm going to do is open up the other code. And I'm going to pause to drink as well because I'm going fast. And I'll read off a message real quick as well. From Aaron Dam here, we have to use SAM CLI versus serverless framework. I use the serverless framework. I have used AWS SAM. It is very similar to CloudFormation. What I will say is that there's no wrong choice. I have a preference towards serverless framework. I would say that they're very similar. And so even CDK or other options out there, they're all infrastructure as code. And you're always building to compile to CloudFormation. And so if you understand CloudFormation and you understand at least one framework, then you can take that knowledge and apply it in other areas. All right, so now let's jump into something that's a bit deeper than our temporary one solution here. Now we're going to get into the backend and front end side. And so we talked about the backend a bit. So I think we should just jump straight to the front end side and look at what that looks like, just so we have an idea. So I have two files here in this front end folder, which y'all can find at the GitHub address. The HTML code is connected to this logic.js file. And then it has maybe 11 lines of code or something. So it's or 9 lines of code. Have something that says create user, some inputs, some buttons, all that stuff. And then when we look at it in the console, or sorry, in the browser, move this thing out of the way. This is what it looks like. So I'm going to refresh the page. And so we have create user, we have get users, and behind this is JavaScript code, which is talking to our real API, our CRUD API, and then returning back data, the same thing that we were doing earlier in Insomnia and also in the browser. And then we use that data to then show it in the HTML. So the first thing I'll do is I'll create a user here. Actually, let's do the get user. So click this button. Ah, perfect. So I deleted the API before we started the talk. So let's redeploy the real API and then connect it live, because that is amazing. Okay, so I'm going to cd back out of this folder here and then go into the backend folder. The backend folder also has a serverless.yaml file, but it is much more complex than the last one we did. There's still a provider, there's still plugins, there's still a function section. We still have these separate Lambda functions. So get all users, update user, create user. And we also now have a resources down here. This is CloudFormation way of defining a DynamoDB table. And so for all of our stuff to work, of course, we need a database behind it, because we want it to keep working even after we close the server, or we want to keep that data. Even if we refresh the page, we don't want all the data to be lost. And so we have to store it in a database. And so this is how you create a database. And without going through line by line of how that works, we're basically defining that the key for our database table is user. All right, so now with that context, you can see here that it looks very similar. We have a handler, we have the events, we have HTTP, it's a path of users, it's a method of get. We still have cores, which is just important to make sure you always got cores true on. For most things, if you're doing something more secure, maybe don't do it as shotgun approach as I'm doing right now. And then we have environment variables. And so our backend code needs to know what the database table is. And so we're passing this table in using what's called dynamic syntax and serverless framework. Another plug to the course. If you're interested in that, there's videos on the course that actually go over building this full template out line for line and how that all those things interact. So let's go ahead and make the deployments. So I'm going to run the same command that we did earlier. This time I'm going to pass some what's called CLI flags. As we talked about, you can deploy to dev or QA or to prod. And what does that mean? What that really means is that you're just changing the names of the resources. So if we deploy it to dev, then we'll have a Lambda function that says my lambda dash dev. If we deploy it to stage prod, it'll say my lambda dash prod. So we're going to do dash dash stage prod, and we're going to deploy to the region of US East 2. And we'll do verbose mode, so we look like we're doing a lot. And so now it's going to create 5 Lambda functions, a DynamoDB table, the API gateway instance, all the IAM permissions for all the stuff to connect together. And then once it's connected, we'll get a API URL back that we can then go into our front end folder here and into our logic.js, and we'll swap this one out for our newly deployed API. And so hopefully that's helping like close the loop on what is happening here. We deploy the backend with our Lambda function, our REST API, the database table, and then we take the URL that it gives us back and then we put it into our front end code so that they connect together and talk. Perfect. While this is happening, this is the course. So this is Serverless Zero to Paid Professional. And if you click through here, you can get an idea for what gets talked about. So in this course, I do a little bit more of a whiteboarding about how the flow happens. I'm going through it fast right now, but between the front end to the back end and then back to the front end, we go very deeply into what is AWS Lambda, what are all the different buttons and dials you can press, what about the same thing for API Gateway, DynamoDB, CloudWatch, and so on. And then we have specific sections on building out the C for CRUD, R for CRUD, U for CRUD, D for CRUD. Then we recap it, and then we get into Serverless Framework basics, Serverless Framework, more advanced stuff, or starting to get more advanced. This was the one that I just mentioned, Serverless Dynamic Variables. That's what this weird syntax here with the curly brace and the $sign, this video covers that. And then we talk a little bit about Serverless Enterprise. This one needs to be updated. And then finally, we get into a Serverless Framework deep dive. And I would say this is like a shallow deep dive because you can go even further in, and we'll talk more about that in future releases of the course. Okay, so it's now finished deploying. We now have our slick new endpoint here, and we can copy that. And now we just need to go into our logic.js, and we can paste it. Okay, perfect. So we don't have to deploy anything because this is just a local index.html file with a local JavaScript file. So we should just be able to go back and then just refresh the page. And then now we can try to create a user. But first, let's try to get a user. Great, it works. That's fantastic. So it says no users found in the database. What just happened here is that we clicked this button and then it made an API request to our get users API, which we just deployed to AWS. And then it came back with this JSON here in the Chrome console that said all users have been fetched. And we can see that there are 0 items in our database table. And that's because prior to the talk, I destroyed the other table. We've just recreated it. So now we have to populate the database. So I'm going to create one here called Ryan Jones. I'm going to say job is developer and hit create. And now you can see it show up here. We'll create a couple more. Say Tyler Jenkins and say project manager. Lewis Clark. I'm really pushing my creativity. I'll say engineer. Okay, so now we have a couple of things created, much better than the last time I did this. The last time I was creating users, I was like Ford, name, job, dealership. We have Lewis Clark here, Ryan Jones, and Tyler Jenkins, and now we can update some of these. So let's go ahead and delete myself. So when we just click that, another API request happened. So that we have an API request happens when we click this get users button. That hits our get users API and brings back the data from our database. When we hit the create button up here for create user, that's then sending a request with the JSON with the name Lewis Clark and engineer in the request body to API gateway, and then to our Lambda function, and then storing it in DynamoDB. And then it's coming back and saying, I did my job. And then now we just hit the delete button, and that's making an API request to our delete endpoint for users. And we're passing it the ID of the user in that request, and it's deleting it from our database. And so I'll show what the backside of that looks like, but let's also look at the update functionality. So for Lewis Clark, let's update this and say Ford dealership. Confirm. And you can see that we've now updated this. And if we refresh the page, it's not just here locally. We can click it again and we get back those users again. And then we can delete Ford dealership, and now it's deleted from our database. And so let's look at the other side of the view inside of the AWS console. So before, we just had this one API created. That was from our temporary one. But if we go back to APIs here, we should see multiple. So now we have prod SRA backend, which sounds much more official and professional. So we have /users here with get, post, and then we have the /ID, which allows us to pass a dynamic user ID into the URL of the API. So our Lambda function can then take that and then look up the record in the database by the ID. And so we have delete, get, and put down here as well. And we can go to DynamoDB. I'm gonna let that open, and I'm also gonna show the functions here. So now you can see we have a lot more functions. I'm gonna filter it by SRA backend. And you can see here, these are our CRUD Lambda functions that we've created using that template. Update user, get user, all that stuff. You can also click on one of them, and you can see that it's connected to API gateway. So the API gateway is the trigger to Lambda function. And then we have a DynamoDB table here. So let's look at that. So we go to tables. You can see we have one table called SRA backend users table prod. And this is created by this line here. So earlier we talked about we're using CloudFormation to create the DynamoDB table. That's 75 to 85. So those 10 lines of code create what you're seeing right here. And you can even see that the primary partition key is user ID. And if you look back here, you can see the word user ID. And you can also see this attribute type of a S, and that stands for string. So hopefully all that's connecting together what's taking place there. 10 lines of code in that serverless YAML translates to a database table being accessible and created. And then we created one here called Tyler Jenkins, project manager. And so we can just go in here and we can click delete. We can flip back to the index.html file here and refresh it. I guess we didn't really need to refresh it, but we did anyways. And we can see no users found in the database. Then we can come in here and we create one called 1234. We're going to add a string of name, so Joe, and a string of job, say dev. And then if we flip back to the index.html, click it again, eventually looks like it's thinking about it. There it goes. So Joe works as a dev, and we can update this here, say Joe J, and confirm it. And if we flip back to DynamoDB, refresh, we can see that our database is now updated. What's taking place there is the full end-to-end CRUD functionality happening. And yeah, there's more stuff here that I could dive into. I think on time we're already at 2:11, but I'll just show this really brief thing here. I really liked how this turned out when I was building this like very simple front end, is these lines here. And what happens is that I have a button, and the button is called like get users. And so that button would be this button here. So when we click it, it's then going to run this function, which is a helper function called fetch users. And that's on line 12. And the first thing we do is we basically clear out the HTML. So that way, when we click it multiple times, it erases it and then populates it again. So we're not adding to it over and over again. And then we have this cool thing that I learned about today, actually, which was you can do this fetch command natively now. I don't think this existed a couple years ago. And then we pass it our URL, which is the one to our API gateway. We say the method is get. Let me make sure this is bigger so it's clear to see. So method is get, and then we do promises here. So I won't get too much into that, but what's basically happening is we're saying go to that URL, to our API URL, and then get the response from it. So we see response.json, and then we're going to loop over it here, and we're going to create HTML out of it. And that's where this Joe-J shows up from dynamically, and also the delete and update button. And so you can see this on line 23, it's saying item.name, which would be Joe J. And then it's a P for paragraph, item.name works at item.job. And you can see that here. This is the paragraph with the dynamic database fields coming in. And then we have the delete button. So you can see here button and delete. So that's this button here. And we're giving it a name, which is a property on the button HTML element, which is item user ID. And this allows us to know, say, so if we have multiple users here, how do we know which user to delete? It's something that you get into once you actually start building and you go, oh, wow, all the buttons are the same. So how do I know which one should trigger the delete? And to do that, you can pass the name field here and give it the unique user ID. And then we also have the update here. So just to talk about the delete one, because it's a bit simpler than the update one. Let's now close this one down and let's go to the delete user function. So you can see here it's being passed a user ID. And the user ID is coming from here, event.target.name. And so when we look at, excuse me, where was that? When we look at this line here, we can see the button is delete button, and we can see item.user_ID, and we can see that it's underneath the name field. And so up here, this is inside of a on-click event. So if a click happens and it comes from delete button, then trigger this function called delete user, and then grab event.target.name, which is the ID of the user, and pass it to the delete user function. And that's how we get this user ID. And then we get the URL from the very top here, our API URL. And we pass it the user ID that's being fed in from the name attribute on that specific button. And then we're saying fetch users. And that then runs this function, which goes out and refreshes our list here. So we're deleting the user. And so they're getting cleared out of our database by hitting our API endpoint for delete. And then right after that, we're then rerunning the fetch for the users. So then everything comes back. So if we run this here and we hit delete for Joe J, it now says no users found in the database because it first sent the delete request with that unique ID. And then it refreshed the user list and said there's no users found. Yeah, let me stop there and let me switch back to the presentation and also the slides, or also to the chat. 1 second. Okay, and let me look at chat. Yeah, the vanilla JavaScript. it actually was cool to see that I was able to do as much as I did with it. Okay, so let's see where we're at. Confusing, but very interesting. Yeah, it's a lot. It is definitely a lot. I would recommend a course. I go a little bit slower through all this stuff, like way slower. And it comes from a perspective of, like, we're already jumping to infrastructure as code right now. In the course, I do everything in the console first manually. It's a much longer, slow process, but that's how I actually learned to do this. What we're doing right now is, if you look at the course description I showed, we don't actually get into like all this stuff. Let me go all the way back. So we don't get into actually doing infrastructure as code in the course until here. So we already went through probably 40 videos or something. And so in this Mintbean talk, we're jumping straight to infrastructure as code. And so you can see the power of it and see how like easy it looks for me to be doing it. And you could take that template, run the same command that I ran, and you would be able to see that result happen, which I would highly recommend that. But we're jumping a few rings here, or rungs. Okay. How long would you say is an average time to complete the entire course? It's 90, I think it's 93 videos. And I want to say that I tried really hard to split it by topic, which created a lot more videos. But I think some of the videos could be even less than 5 minutes or something in some cases. I would say it's probably like 3-4 hours right now. And in the future, we want to add like CI/CD pipelines, more serverless framework, more use cases for building stuff. But right now it's probably like 3 to 4 hours of video. And if you're following along with it, maybe that's 10 to 12 hours of working through it, maybe a bit longer, maybe 20 hours of following through. If you're really trying to follow each command, copy the code, run it, test it, play around with it yourself, debug problems that happen. Oh, thanks, Navi. Appreciate that. Fetch API for the win. Yeah, there we go. Where can I find Ryan's contact info? Thank you for sharing that, Navi. And yeah, vanilla JavaScript. That's taking me back. Yeah. Vanilla JavaScript. Cool. Some additional slides that I had here this was a setup article. So we already looked at that here, this guide for serverless. And then we had the template one. This is the one that I already shared. Remember though, that it is on GitHub, it is the Mintbean branch. And so if you go to the master branch, you will not see what we're showing right now. And you might be confused about where the code is. And then I also had template 2. This gets way more advanced, but this was the stuff that was unreleased for the course. I'll open it up so you can see what I'm talking about. GitHub for, so it's in here. And what we're basically doing in this one, and I try to make it iterative. The master one was like the basic, and then we get into a little bit more advanced each time. This one adds in Cognito, and Cognito is used for actually doing sign-in and authentication. So login, register, all that stuff. This stuff is not released yet to the course, but the code is actually here if you wanted to flip through it. And then finally, we have this resources page here, which I left some links to, which is like Medium, blog, the templates that we have currently. So I'll show you. This is what Serverless Guru does for clients. We build all these serverless templates. And that's why there's so many of them. And some of them get really deep. So like the serverless standard starter here, it's a full tutorial and information about how all this stuff works and code snippets. And so you can play around and look through that as well. We also have a free serverless intro course. All full transparency here, I think this was made quite a while ago. It might have similar videos or similar context to this guide to the first serverless project. And so you could flip through that as well if that's interesting. I think this one's probably less than 30 minutes or an hour. And then we have the Talking Serverless podcast. So you can see here, we've got episode 38, 37, and a whole bunch of people. Here's my face and also Josh Proto, the 2 hosts of the podcast. And then we have all these different episodes here where we dive into serverless and talk about it with the experts in the field. And then, of course, if you're interested in our local meetups that we do, not so much local anymore with all the changes in the world, but it is now remote. And we share it through Zoom. And recently we've done some on serverless design transformation 101, which was a talk from someone on our team, as well as load testing serverless applications, enterprise serverless migration and adoption. And these get a bit more into the advanced side of things, but it could be good to listen in and then take pieces of it and then try to experiment with it and ask questions. That's the biggest thing. And then once again, here's my contact information. On that note, let's open it up to other questions, things like that. Do we get access to these slides somehow? Yes, I will figure this out right now. So Serverless CRUD API. Let me open this up to the internet. A dangerous move, but it's just a slideshow with no sensitive material on it. Let's see chats. Yeah, there are the slides. to the chat. Carlos, yeah, no problem. If you have any questions, definitely send them over.
Awesome. Amazing stuff.
Yeah, it's hard to condense all the years until, because I wanted to like try to, here's all of it. It's going to be recorded. You got all the links to it, so you can go back, flip through it, step through the code.
Yeah, I'll definitely make sure that we put this stuff up and it lives on our YouTube. See you guys in our next talk. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your
See you,
Wednesday.
everyone.
Bye, Ryan.
Bye. Bye.